I'd like to say something about an amorphous thing, if you like, which is the establishment. The reason for this is we're going to be looking at the end of the Conservative era. And one of the standard sort of lines on this is that what happens is that the establishment, the chaps, sort of in the end come up against history, and history says, "No, you're done, mate. You're finished. Your days are over." But I thought if we're going to do that, and we're going to go on to look at the dog days of Macmillan, the end of Macmillan, we're going to look at Hume, we're going to look at the '64 election, and before those, we'll look at the rather scandals that beset the Macmillan administration. But actually, before we do that, I think we need to try and just outline a little bit who we're talking about and what. So, the first thing I thought I'd do is show you how to become a member of the 1950s establishment, which kind of slightly knackers half of you straight away, I'm afraid, because the females here, well, you can marry one if you like, or do various other things, as we'll see later on another time. But you ain't going to be one of them in the fullest sense of the term. You can't be one of the chaps. So, how do you become one? Well, first you've got to go to the right school, and we can kind of illustrate this if we look at all the post-war prime ministers. So, Attlee went to Haileybury. Churchill went to Harrow. Eden, along with Macmillan and Hume, were old Etonians. And even the Labour leader, Hugh Gaitskell, went to Winchester. All bar one of Eden's cabinet went to public school. 10 of them went to Eton. The exception, by the way, was Lord Walton, who went to the terribly scummy Manchester Grammar School. In 1955, 1 in 5 Conservative backbenchers were Etonian. 3 out of the 4 leading figures in this, what we might think was the wider establishment, the church, judiciary, senior civil service, leading companies even, were educated in public schools. 2/3 of those earning over £1,000 a year, in that day a very large sum, in 1954 were public school educated. So you get the drift? RGS not good enough. Sorry, boys and girls. Then you've got to go to the right university, which of course means Oxbridge, and actually, if you want to be Prime Minister at this point in time, seems to be pretty much Oxford. So Attlee, Eden, Macmillan and Hume were all Oxford. Churchill's the exception, didn't go to university because he wasn't up to it. So, right university. Then you've got to come from the right family. Churchill was a Churchill. I mentioned Eden was a Grey. Macmillan married into the Devonshires, the most influential aristocratic family in the Conservative Party. And Hume was a full-blown Earl. He actually had to renounce his earldom so he could become Prime Minister and enter the House of Commons. A law, by the way, that was initiated by Viscount Stansgate, or Anthony Wedgwood Benn, as he then became, and in later years styled himself as Tony Benn, of whom you may have heard. Then Peter Clarke calculated that 9 members of Macmillan's cabinet, including Macmillan himself and Hume, were related to the 4 great Victorian political dynasties. We've mentioned the Devonshires, I mentioned Bobbety Cecil before, Wab or Harold, and Bobbety Cecil was from the Cecil family. He'd been in politics since the reign of Henry VIII. The same families also gave us, by the way, the editors of the Times, Observer and Mail. Macmillan was directly related to 2 of his own cabinet, indirectly related to about 7 to a third. Just give you one other example. Lord Radcliffe, Haileybury, Oxford, oversaw 6 different public inquiries in the period of the long 50s. So, go to the right school, right university, but most of all, come to the right sort. But the problem was, this is 1963, the end of the Lady Chatterley ban, and the Beatles' first LP, in the words of Philip Larkin. And, this whole Born to Rule thing began to look a bit... The key term that was coined was the establishment, first used by A.J.P. Taylor in 1953. It's funny, always crops up, isn't it? In 1955, a Conservative commentator, Henry Fairley, used the same term. And after Suez, it becomes a pretty ubiquitous term. And when it has a ubiquitous term, but it is pejorative, i.e., a lot of people are saying the establishment are ruining the country. Anthony Sampson published a famous book called The Anatomy of Britain, and it kind of laid bare the tentacles of the establishment, the social, school, family connections that bound the chaps together. By the early 60s, the idea of the establishment and its scions, its members, was pretty much the object of ridicule. The angry young men of the theatre attacked the old world of the well-made plays of Noel Coward. The satire boom arrived. Beyond the Fringe, that was the week that was the first big popular satire programme on telly, and the newly created Private Eye. Famously, Peter Cook's pea take of Macmillan was cruel, very funny, and actually pretty telling. That was the week that was also had it in for Sir Henry Brooke, the last of the Conservative Home Secretaries of this era, who was particularly accident prone, gave the air of a bit of an old duffer and was a bit of an open goal for them. At the same time, you get the rise of a working class culture, what we call kitchen sink drama, for example, and of course, working class music. The Beatles' first LP, the Stones, the Kinks, etc. And it kind of, there's an air around that the coming age is the age of the grammar school man, and indeed woman. Horrors. Wilson and Heath kind of personify this in a way. It was time to paraphrase Harold Wilson for the white heat. In this case, we might call it the white heat of modernity. Mind you, we shouldn't overdo the thrusting class versus the establishment bit. Anthony Sampson wrote The Anatomy of Britain, having a go not so much at who was who, but the fact there were a bunch of amateurs, gentlemanly amateurs. I think the same could be said. The Young Turks of Beyond the Fringe, when they're asked of what they're taking on, they actually say it's complacency. And you see, the thing is, these critics were not exactly thrusting provincial grammar school types themselves. Anthony Sampson, Westminster School, Oxford. Alan Bennett was a grammar school boy, went to Oxford though. Peter Cook, Radley College. Jonathan Miller, St Paul's, went to Cambridge, did the footlights, and therefore that's still ruse, isn't it, to become a comedian. The creators of Private Eye cut their satirical teeth as schoolboys at Shrewsbury School, public school again. Heath, Wilson, Thatcher, Healy, etc. were all thrusting young grammar school boys and girls, and they still went to Oxford. And the only one to keep his working class accent, or his lower middle class accent in this case, was Harold Wilson. All the others, to varying degrees, plumbed their accents up. In the case of, I think, Heath and Thatcher, slightly painfully so. Funnily enough, the new broom, the sensational victor of the Orpington by-election of 1962, when the Liberals won the safest seats in the country, next door to Macmillan's own seat of Bromley, with a thumping majority. The winner was Eric Lubbock, and the thrusting new broom in 1971 inherited his title as the 4th Baron of Avebury. Oh well. By the way, having been to Harrow, and you've guessed it, Oxford. Macmillan did appoint some from without. I mentioned Heath. Some, Ernest Marples, he might well have been better without. The establishment was real. It did exist, and it would become the object of something much more interesting very shortly as a wave of scandals erupted over it. Britain was changing, but we mustn't overdo their uselessness. Many of the chaps were very capable chaps. Macmillan, obviously, Eden, Hume, indeed. They had a lot about them. But somehow there was something about the group of them together that didn't quite fit. And there's something about Macmillan's impersonation almost, his act, his shtick, if you like, as the chap's chap, that began to ring untrue as the 1960s really kicked into gear. Next time, sex.